Good morning and welcome to the next installment of the Daily Word. It is Monday, July the 13th, and we pick up the narrative in Acts 23 as we've been on this journey with Paul, as he has both experienced the joy of preaching the gospel and the peril of persecution and trial as he goes through difficult times at the hands of both the Romans and the Jews. In this particular chapter, we see God use the Romans to actually help Paul, and we see the Jews and the high priest in particular harming Paul. And the high priest himself, Ananias, in chapter 23, verse 2, orders Paul to be struck after in verse 1, he simply says to the council, "I've lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day." In other words, he's saying, I've lived according to the will of God. I've walked obediently. And they don't like that very much. They've really had enough of Paul preaching the gospel. And in this particular chapter, verse 3, Paul responds in a way that might raise your eyebrows as you go through your daily reading. He says, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall, to Ananias, who was known, by the way, to be the nastiest or one of the nastiest high priests there ever was. Josephus wrote of him that he was pro-Rome, extremely cruel, and extremely greedy. So this is not a good guy. Paul says, God's going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law, and yet contrary to the law, you order me to be struck? Of course, it was not lawful for them to beat on somebody who was at trial. Now, you might wonder what a whitewashed wall is, and Jesus used a similar phrase with the Pharisees when he called them whitewashed tombs. What that means is very similar to what we do today. We see a structure that's crumbling or something that doesn't look very good on the outside, and we paint over it. Well, what he's saying is basically, you look real clean and painted over, whitewashed on the outside. But inside, you're filthy, Ananias. You're a hypocrite. And Paul stands his ground, ultimately coming to understand that he's talking to a high priest. Now, scholars believe perhaps in the mix-up of men and the stirring surrounding them apprehending Paul, that Paul might have not have caught that this was the high priest, Ananias, or maybe there's some irony here, and Paul is being a bit sarcastic, saying in verse 5, I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest. And maybe he's saying that he wasn't acting like a high priest. But at any rate, Paul comes to realize that he's the high priest, or decides he needs to respect Ananias, even though he's not a good man, based on his office, the call of the high priest at that time. And Paul, even in the midst of this moment, is going to honor God and honor the requirement of God to respect leaders, even when he does not agree or that leader is acting in an unlawful way. The storyline goes on, and eventually the narrative finds us, or takes us to a point where the Romans intervene. And Paul is sent to Felix the governor. And later on in chapter 23, towards the end, he's told, I'll give you a hearing when your accusers arrive. And he commanded him to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. Now, this is in verse 35. They've come to Caesarea. They delivered the letter to the governor. It's actually Paul's nephew who had heard about plans that the high priest had when they had held him to just have him killed. They just really wanted to get rid of him. And the Romans intervened. And God, in a moment, speaks to the Apostle Paul and makes it clear to him and reveals to him that he's going to make it to Rome. He's going to stand in Rome. In verse 11, the following night, the Lord stood by him and said, take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome. A moment of encouragement from the Lord. And really the takeaway for us in this chapter, that the sovereignty of God is at work in the midst of confusing situations, unjust situations, challenging situations. Certainly a situation where Paul deserved a fair trial, a fair look. He was already being apprehended in a way of injustice. He was a Roman citizen, so it finally worked out for him in the end, and he'd get a fair hearing perhaps. But overall, the main takeaway is that in the midst of all of that, God is sovereign. God's purposes and plans were not going to be thwarted. He said to Paul, you will testify in Rome. And I think that that's the takeaway in a chapter like this that you and I need to hear in times like these. that God is sovereign, that he's working on our behalf, that he's there, that his plans and purposes are good and perfect, even if our definition of good and perfect might be a little different than what God is working things out to be. And you might find yourself in a bit of a trial, probably a little different than Paul in the narrative we read, but overall facing challenges. And rest assured, Christian, that God is in control. That there's not a molecule in this universe outside of his view or his control. And that even when things look dark, he's working. Trust him. Follow him. Obey him. Lean on him. And find rest, even in the midst of turmoil, knowing that he is in control.